Welcome to the Athlete Climate Academy, where we talk with athletes, scientists, and communicators in critical conversations about the climate crisis. We've got a cracking guest for you today. Rob Nelson, a biologist, documentary filmmaker, and science communicator. Rob is known for his work on the Science Channel's Secrets of the Underground and Animal Planet's Life After Chernobyl. An Emmy Award-winning filmmaker, he focuses on creating impactful science films, and as the director of Untamed Science and the host of popular YouTube channels, Rob's work educates, inspires action to preserve our planet for future generations. Rob, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me here, Hugh. Lots to talk about today.
So much to talk about. We'll try and keep it down to the 30 minutes. But can you start off by telling our audience a little bit about your background and how you became the science communicator you are today?
Sure. Well, I started out my career as a biologist. I was very fascinated with population ecology of fishes in particular. And I got into science communication because I realized that as a scientist, the most boring thing of the job was sitting and listening to other scientists try to explain the work that they're doing. It was like pulling my hair out all the time, sitting in the audience. So my goal was to make every presentation that I did interesting and engaging. And when I was in grad school, what I realized is that it was hard to get people excited about, and these were undergraduate students, about the wildlife around them while you're sitting in the cube of the desks where everyone was. So what I did is I took my video camera and I went out and I would film echinoderm lessons while I was scuba diving, or I would film tree snail lessons while I was up in the mountains in Hawaii. And I would just show it for 3 or 4 minutes as an engagement tool to get people excited about the topic. And then we would dive into the nitty-gritty. And every time I taught a class, they said that was the best thing about the class, was like learning about that. It made people loosen up. They got engaged. And then the rest of the biology department said, we want those too. And so I just gave them to everyone else. And then I thought, how do I scale this even more? I actually really liked this part of it. Got into doing science filmmaking in a second master's degree in Montana, and then kind of took that to the next level with hundreds and hundreds of short form videos that was replicating what I did as a science teacher at the university, but this time to a more general audience that wasn't sitting right in front of me. And so it modified the way I tell stories, and I've told lots and lots of stories to now lots of different types of people.
It does feel like we are doing very, very similar things. And when we first met in 2015, I think we first got on a call together, before like video conferencing or video meetings were a big thing. I was on a shoot for, I think, Microsoft in the Alps, talking about the glaciers, how they're disappearing. And we kind of connected and going like, oh, we're doing like almost the exact same thing. I think you're just a much better version than me at doing this kind of stuff. Huh. So
I said you were the UK version of what I was doing, but we had the same emphasis of like, how do we get kids excited about the world around them?
Yeah, exactly. And nowadays you're still doing the similar kind of thing, and I'm still doing a similar kind of thing. But I think with more emphasis, well, we change our tactics depending on the audience, because you started doing it for teaching and getting kids really excited and curious about that kind of stuff. But that isn't the same kind of way as you'd approach something now, I suppose. Well, maybe for your YouTube, you would still do that kind of thing. But then if you're talking to policymakers, if you're talking to farmers, you've got such a breadth of audiences now. Is that something you think about, like when you're making this kind of stuff, this new content, which is great, by the way, but like, how do you go about making sure that content suits the people that you're putting it out for?
Well, the first thing I always ask when I talk to any scientist that I work with is, if we're going to tell a story together, who's the audience? Like, how are they going to watch it also? So those are like two different questions. Because half of the work that I do is on YouTube, I know how people are going to watch it. They're going to probably watch it on their phone, or maybe get sent a link on their phone. But it's a very general audience. I can't choose that audience. But one of the things that I always focus on is, how can you not ostracize part of your audience? And by doing that, there's certain key words that instantly politicize the whole conversation. And so I try to avoid that. So that is the one thing I think about. So as we progress in years, certain things that were not politicized are now politicized. And it's very little minute differences in the way that you talk about it. So, I know you do the Climate Academy and this podcast, which is focused on climate. Well, I've spent now, this is going to my third season making PBS documentaries where we go out into the field and we talk to people in the field, literally farmers and foresters and different people like that. And you don't talk to those people in the same way that you would a group of scientists. So talking in the field is then different to then how you release the film, to then how you might present it in the classroom or in the audience. So I've become very aware of these major differences. And of course, that's also one of the things that a little bit concerns me about the conversation, but maybe we can get into that a little bit later as well.
Yeah, when we're making podcasts or films, we chose the Athlete Climate Academy as a bit of a catch-all for sustainability stories, for climate stories, for nature stories, for outdoor stories, just because you have to have some kind of catch-all for that. And we thought the audience that we want to have, which is a really engaged outdoor audience, and are really passionate about learning about the climate crisis, they need something to latch onto. So we're really lucky that we've already got a super engaged audience anyway. But making those kind of documentaries for people to kind of switch them onto it, what kind of strategies have you found the most effective for like engaging with people and turning them onto a subject rather than having an already captive audience?
Well, you have to start with an amazing hook, obviously. That's the important part. So if they're going to get interested in what you're talking about, they have to feel like it's worth the investment in time, like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever it is. I think part of the problem with talking about climate right at the moment is that depending on how you deliver it in the first 10 to 20 seconds, you're either going to turn on an audience or you're going to completely turn them off. So, it's difficult at sometimes to completely generalize the left and the right, because maybe in Europe it's a little different, the left and the right, but in the US, you can do that to some degree. It's a little bit unfortunate. People should be, I think, free thinking and have lots of ideas on both sides. But if you talk about climate as an apocalyptic thing, that's a left narrative, and it will turn off the right instantly. And so you have to be real careful how you deliver that info about climate in the first 20 or 30 seconds. And I think that is my problem with the current storytelling about climate and why it's only reaching half of the population.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen in studies time and again that if you want to effectively persuade people and change people's minds, and it's one thing that we do want to do is for people who aren't as switched on to the climate crisis or aren't taking aren't giving the politicians the permission structure to go and lobby on their behalf for big kind of progressive climate solutions, which people like me do want. Going in negatively instead of going in positively does not change people's minds. Having arguments on social media and calling people out does not change people's minds. Positivity just does. So having that positive spin on things, even if I do think, and many of my colleagues think, that it's going to get pretty bad, not necessarily apocalyptic, but it will get pretty bad. If you want to change people's minds, then putting that positive spin on it just works as an effective strategy of persuading people.
Well, and I fully agree with you. I think it's worth noting that, when you refer to it, it's climate crisis. That's not a very positive spin, right?
That's true.
It could be. It could be changed a little bit, because I don't see. Here's the point in time that it changed for me was during the middle of the pandemic. I started doing podcasts with different people. There was a teacher from New England who had a podcast. He's an environmental science teacher. also the sports coach. So, he wasn't coming directly from the university as a professor, but he was the one teaching all the kids about the current climate condition that we're all in. And he asked me a question. He's like, Rob, how is it that you can teach people about wanting to do something in the environment and like do good, like to help with biodiversity or reforestation or whatever, when in 20 or 30 years there won't be any nature left at all? And I stopped and I was like, you're joking, right? And he's like, huh? No, I mean, because with the climate, there won't be any nature left. And I was like, oh my gosh. And so I had to talk it through with him. I was like, that's not what you believe, right? And I started to realize that that's a pretty common feeling, is that people, having listened to climate stories, feel that nature in its current existence, well, I mean, you can argue what that is, but that there's almost no hope because it's just all being flushed down the tube right now. So like why care about reforesting and helping with invasive species and biodiversity loss and deforestation and all those things if the climate crisis is going to send everything right down the tubes? And that made me sad, because as a biologist, I know that's not the reality. I mean, yeah, things are going to change in certain ways, but if we don't tackle some of the other things that affect biodiversity, whether that's working on fire systems, invasive species, some of the things I mentioned before, helping with coastal fisheries, like those are going to be way more impactful on the animals, like orders of magnitude more impactful than the increase in temperature, you see. And so it made me realize that a lot of it, unfortunately, maybe has been the narrative is pushed a little bit too far, and it could severely affect people's mental health to the point that they're giving up on the idea. And then that means less is happening than if we try to add some nuance to the story and maybe say, well, also there's all these other things that are important and you can do something about those. Let's not forget about climate, but let's not think it's the end of the world. I think that's my view right now, is that I don't meet anyone who thinks that climate is not a problem. Like, I actually think we've already convinced everyone climate's a problem. I think what I fear is that we've convinced everyone who has zero science background that it's a meteor coming and it's going to destroy the earth and we're all screwed. And then it's taking utility out of people, because it's hard for any one individual to do too much. I mean, it's hard to see that you're doing anything. I mean, you can do a lot of work to help with the climate, but you can't do it. Whereas if you had a yard, you could plant native species. You could help do environmental cleanups in your little area, and you could actually really make some difference, which would then help everyone feel better about where they are. And so that's one of the problems that I see, and I don't exactly know how to solve it, but it's one of my hesitancies of continuing to push the apocalyptic narrative, is I feel like we've already done that, and we need to now teach new things to people.
Yeah, and it's something that I think about a lot, and for the terms that we use, it's been shown that they make a massive difference. Like, it was a study in the US looking at using the term fossil gas instead of natural gas, and what people's perceptions were of using natural gas, if it's called fossil rather than if it's called natural. And they had a more negative view of fossil gas than natural gas, even though it's the same thing, just called different things. And I think about the climate crisis quite a lot, and it was a specific term that I've adopted and chosen to use because global warming was a term for it, and it was decided by some people that pushing a certain narrative with global warming was not okay. And then climate change became a thing, and then people started saying, well, the climate changes all the time anyway, so climate change is just a natural thing that happens. And we're like, okay, we need a new term again then. So climate crisis or climate emergency became the thing because it's more urgent. It's and it is more negative. You are right that it's not a positive spin on things.
I see.
But the way in which we talk, the way in which we communicate, all that stuff really matters. And that's why I wanted to have you on the podcast, is because you're someone who thinks about that quite a lot. It's like, how do we meet people where they are, using terms that they are okay with? And, you know, if you're going out to interview a farmer on the East Coast who's getting affected by their crops failing or lack of water or something that's just happening to them, how do we find their stories and personalize it to them?
Right. Well, so here's one of the observations that I've made, having worked with lots and lots of people that are on the ground doing this. And a lot of the people in the rural habitats, there we go, such a biologist term to say, the habitats, but they're a lot more right-leaning. They just are, naturally. And so it ends up being mostly left-leaning in cities, which is interesting because what that it seems to indicate is the people on the right are a little bit more attuned to what's actually happening on the ground with the environment. And the city dwellers, they read about it online, you know, so they're not seeing it as well. Which is a weird way of saying it because, but somehow that represents some reality. So a couple of things that you don't do when you're out in the field talking with a farmer is you don't talk about global warming or climate change. You don't say it like that. You talk about how the climate is changing. Everyone's on board with the climate changing. They all know the climate's changing, especially if they're a farmer with any significant farm fields. They're using the current data to try to predict how to farm better. You know, and that might be a cotton field. Trying to think of the other ones we've done. Local growers of organic crops. We did some apple orchard farmers. And because the challenge is they're just trying to figure out a way to farm better. And so they don't need to be convinced that the climate's changing. They just are, I think because of social media, very turned off by the words and what the implications are behind that. Like they're upset with the other parts of the narrative, which are not related to the climate is changing. Everyone seems to be on board with the climate's changing. And the best that I can figure out, it's maybe it's more of the moral judgment that goes along with climate change. That seems to be kind of one of the differences. Like, in other words, if you're a farmer, you don't always see it as bad. Like, this is the reality. They're looking at the data and they're trying to find the opportunities. And for a lot of the people, we'll always put in the bad things into the docs because it's funded by PBS and it's about climate change, and so it's supposed to be bad, according to PBS. But the farmers don't always see it that way. And so they're just telling us about the day, and we selectively pull out those pieces. But I think on the other side, the people in the city are all convinced that it has to be bad, every little piece of climate change. And I think that's one thing that is the nuance in talking about climate change that a little bit has bothered me as we move forward. You can't talk about it as maybe a little bit bad, but some things are okay, and some things maybe are good. Like, you literally can't say that and put that out and get funded the next year to do the same set of documentaries. But the reality is that some of that is true. It just depends how you see it. Like, obviously, if you're talking about glaciers and you love glaciers melting, bad. If you live in an area that's getting a little more rain and you have a little more dryness, because some areas get more rain, things might get a little warmer. Like, if you want to grow crops and you're in northern Canada, actually it might be nice if it was a little warmer, right? So that's the thing that's I've found interesting, is there is some perspective that you could have, that it doesn't have to be all bad. And sometimes that's the view by necessity that the people in the field have taken. If they see it all like as doom and gloom all the time, they're the ones working the field. It's going to be really bad for them. They can't view it that way, you know? And so I don't know what to do with that information, but it's an observation I started to make. And it's the same thing with the environmental science teacher. Like, he's already put everything about climate change is bad spin on it. And on top of that, we won't have any nature. It's like, well, okay, well, there's some nuance that could be changed there. And I don't know if it's great for every middle school kid to feel like they're effed, like they're totally screwed as like, I just don't know about it. Because I worry about the kids.
Yeah, it's one of those things that, yeah, I think we all do. And it's one of those things that's a really
that are
big
going
paradox
through right now, and I have to tone it down. Yeah, go ahead.
Climate anxiety is a huge thing, but it's such a paradox of the thing that we need to do to kind of like make more, to get a move on and start tackling the problems that the climate crisis does cause, and shift in weather patterns, instability. We're going to see more kind of refugees from climate refugees and the likes. We need to get a shift on and start thinking about those and making those changes. And to do that, we need positive stories, because people are only moved by positive stories. So there are a bunch of bad things that come along with the climate crisis, but we have to tell good stories to get them to change. And that's for me, that's a big paradox.
Well, you present something that's interesting that I had a little bit of time to think about. I think the increased intensity of storms is an interesting one, like hurricanes and stuff. How do you tell that story? And there's multiple ways to tell it that I can just envision thinking about it. One is, okay, we know what the climate data is. There seems to be a trend and an increase in severe storms. Well, how do you give people utility to want to make a difference? Well, one, you could try to get people to help pass legislation that will then, down the road, help climate change. Obviously, that's kind of the narrative right now. The other is you could say, hey, intense climate storms are going to be increasing, so you guys could get degrees in engineering and make sure that homes are better suited for this. And that's actually something you can tangibly do right now and, make a huge difference, maybe more of a difference than you would with stopping climate change, because there is quite a delay. I mean, if you just think about it rationally. And I don't know if there's much reception in the media to present that there is even a second option and a second way that you could view it that's very reasonable. Like, yeah, let's just build stronger homes. Let's make sure they can withstand hurricanes, and let's go to the places that are most affected by these things and places that don't have strong homes. I mean, Florida is getting stronger hurricanes, but Florida is getting a lot of stronger homes. So not as many people are dying as they used to, right? So that's just an example. Maybe we could spread that to the rest of the world, places like Bangladesh and all the places that get hit really hard by things that people aren't as protected. So, that's just one perspective, and I throw it out because I've started to see that there are some other perspectives.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that I enjoy conversing with you about, is like, we're all trying to get to the same point, which is, even though the climate is changing, we want people to live happier and healthier lives going forward. How do we get there? That's the big thing. Is like, what do we put in place now that's going to protect that? Because we can build stronger homes that are going to like keep people safer for longer. But if we keep burning fossil fuels at the rate that we are going, then the weather's just going to intensify and intensify. We have to build stronger homes. And the move away from things like fossil fuels is a pretty, like, there was a call quite recently to like have fossil fuels be used across Europe in the same way, or seen in the same way that we did tobacco and sometimes alcohol, where you can't advertise tobacco products, so you should be able to advertise fossil fuel products, that kind of stuff. So that's why I like chatting to you, is because we both agree that we want to get to the same place, but sometimes have very different views on how we're going to get there. And I wonder if like that's not just the way that we solve the climate crisis, is like finding common ground with people and moving towards that place together rather than separately.
Sure. No, I mean, I think the first thing that you have to do if you have any sort of disagreements is you find what is the one thing we can all agree on to start, and then you move forward. See, the
Yeah.
one thing that I worry about also about making literally everything about climate is that it throws other important things into the back seat. And so I can give you an example of that, right? I was in Czechia, which is the Czech Republic, a few years back, and I did a story on rapeseed. This was just a side project I was doing for YouTube, because if you fly into the country, and this is across a lot of Europe, it's these big yellow fields. You'll see them. That's rapeseed. Rapeseed makes rapeseed oil. It also makes canola oil. That's the name brand that they've put on it. But you can take rapeseed and you can turn it into petroleum for cars. Basically, that's how it works. You can turn it into jet fuel even. Now here's the weird thing. These fields were all over Czechia and in the scientists' brothers' farms, thousands of acres. And so he took me into these farms because I was going to make the video, and I was like, tell me a little more about them. He said, well, the unfortunate thing is that they're now 24% of the growing fields in Czechia, incentivized by the current leader of Czechia, with the idea that this will help with their climate zero initiatives. And I was like, okay, well, that's great, because in theory, you're not pulling it out of the ground. You're growing the plants and you're turning it into fuel. And except for the fact that you're using fuel to turn those into fuel, the idea is that it's climate zero, right? So,
Right.
But the problem is that Czechia has now turned 24% of their area into growing fuel, which has some other problems. These fields are so heavily sprayed with pesticides that if you go into that field, you're never coming back out. I mean, if you're an animal, I mean, it's just a dead zone. And you can see that when you're there. It's just there's nothing in a rapeseed field but rapeseed, and it almost feels weird and sterile. They've converted a lot of their forests that were wild areas for plants and animals and diversity back into rapeseed. They've then also converted a lot of their food growing into rapeseed because it's more profitable. And so then what they have to do is they now have to import their food from other places. So places in South America, which were rainforest, or places that were in Southeast Asia, they're turning into producing the food for Czechia and a lot of Europe, instead of it just being grown locally, which then takes fuel to ship that food back. So my point is, it starts to get real fuzzy and complicated, but it's being pushed by the leader of the company or the country at that time, who also had the majority stock in the refineries for rapeseed oil converting over. So, and I doubt that he was all that into a climate initiative, but he knew that if he could just put it under the idea that it's green, he could get it all pushed through, and it was a money-making thing. And so I worry about greenwashing. And if you say, oh, it's climate zero, you can push anything through. So people have to be a little more skeptical. Yeah. Like, okay, let's just look at the nuance behind this. And people don't always want to see that because it's so difficult to learn everything there is. They just need someone to say, is it good or bad? And so the moral judgment on things now has become, is it climate zero? Is it not? Is it good for, is it anti-fossil fuels? Is it, you see what I mean? And so it just made it real clear for people to decide their moral choice, where if you're a biologist and you're now looking at it and you're like, whoa, this is actually not good for the environment. Like, how are we pushing this through? But then you feel like you can't say anything because you're adding some hint of like maybe this climate thing shouldn't be the number one thing in this case. It makes you sound like a denier when you're not a denier. You're just trying to, I don't know, put some hesitancy in the whole thing. So that's another thing I worry about a little bit is, I guess you would call it greenwashing. I'm not sure what the term is, but something like that.
It is rife out there, and it's becoming ever more difficult to go out and, sometimes I see on social media people say, I'm not going to teach you this, you should go out and learn for yourself about a bunch of different social issues and cultural issues that we're struggling with at the moment. If you want to you should be educating yourself about this thing. but it's really difficult for people to go out and have trusted sources that they can get good information from, because we're wading through a sea of literally the entirety of human knowledge. And we're wading through it, trying to find the good stuff and trying to find the stuff that says, yes, this is okay. No, this is not okay. And the thing I like about your films is that you say, well, maybe this is okay, or maybe this is the way we want to go, but also there's this route. So if people want to see that content that you're creating, the nuance that you put into your work, where would they go to find that?
Yeah, it's a good plug for the stuff I'm doing on YouTube right now.
The general internet.
No, StoneAge Man is the channel
everywhere
on YouTube. Well, I have a lot of different channels, but I've decided that a big part of the biology that I need to communicate going forward is how do we interact as humans with the natural world? And so I've created a channel called StoneAge Man, partly because of the idea that it seems very clear we evolved in the Stone Age. And in the Stone Age, we were part of the environment. We weren't separate from it. We used the plants, we used the animals, we cut down trees for boats. And we used fire in lots of different ways because we're the fire species. And I think that there's a lot we can learn to be healthier and happier in our own mental health by taking some pieces from the Stone Age. And so that's kind of what I'm doing right at the moment. I don't deal a lot with climate on YouTube because it is a polarizing issue. I like to stay fairly gray, and we can all agree that mental health and human health is really important. I think unless you want to exterminate all humans on the earth, then maybe you're in a different camp, but everyone else seems to agree on that. And so
ChatGPT is getting smarter there.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So yeah, that's where people can go. And I also am the behind the scenes person for a lot of the PBS documentaries that you might see on digitally floating across the web.
Yeah, those conversations are so good to have. And, I always enjoy everything is tangentially, we live in this climate and how things are changing. Your work in biology is always really interesting to me. The work you're doing, like publicizing kind of mushrooms and this new look at how we should be doing medicine and things. It's all super interesting. Rob, thanks so much. Rob Nelson's a biologist, a documentary filmmaker, and a wonderful, wonderful science communicator. Rob, thanks for coming on the podcast, mate. I appreciate it.
Thanks, you.